The crimson stain spreading across Sarah Miller's torn dress told a story that words never could, a story of persecution, of mob justice gone terribly wrong, and of a town's collective conscience buried beneath years of drought and desperation. As they bound her to the weathered post in Redemption's dusty square, not a single soul dared meet her gaze, for in her eyes they might see reflected the very humanity they had abandoned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's wrists burned against the rough rope as Sheriff Donovan Porter tightened the final knot. The crowd had gathered early, abandoning their daily chores for the spectacle of judgment that had become Redemption's twisted form of entertainment. The drought had stretched into its third year, and with it, reason had withered like the parched crops that once sustained the town's prosperity. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmurs of the gathered townsfolk. "My children. They need their mother." The sheriff stepped back, his face a mask of official duty, but his eyes betrayed the conflict raging. Within, "Quiet now, Mrs. Miller. The judge has made his ruling." 6 months ago, Sarah Miller had been the most respected widow in Redemption Valley. Her husband Thomas had been taken by the influenza that swept through the territory 2 winters past, leaving her with 3 young children and the family's modest cattle ranch 5 miles outside of town. Unlike many widows who sold their land and moved east to family, Sarah had surprised everyone by learning the business, hiring good men, and keeping the Miller Ranch not just afloat but thriving despite the drought that had bankrupted many of her neighbors. That success had bred resentment, whispered rumors, and sideways glances that followed her through town. But it wasn't until Wallace Harrington, the territory's wealthiest rancher and owner of the sprawling Double H, made his first offer to buy her land that trouble truly began. "Water rights," Harrington had explained, seated across from Sarah at her kitchen table, his hat placed carefully beside him. "Your husband never registered them properly. The creek that feeds your property runs through my land first. I'm simply offering a fair price before things get complicated." Sarah had declined politely but firmly. The property was her children's inheritance, and the creek had watered Miller cattle for 15 years without issue. The deed and water rights were filed with the territorial office in Carson City. Her father-in-law had been meticulous about such matters. Harrington's smile never reached his eyes as he replaced his hat. "I admire your spirit, Mrs. Miller, but a woman alone should consider her position carefully. These are difficult times." 3 days later, her cattle began dying, bloated carcasses discovered by her ranch hands along the creek. Poison, they suspected, though nothing could be proven. A week after that, her foreman, Eduardo Vasquez, was beaten unconscious on his way back from town, unable to identify his attackers. When Sarah rode into Redemption to file a complaint with Sheriff Porter, she found the town had already taken sides. Shopkeepers who had extended her credit now demanded immediate payment. The general store owner claimed to be out of supplies she needed. Mothers pulled their children away when she approached, as though widowhood might be contagious. "You're fighting forces you don't understand, Sarah," Pastor Williams had told her after Sunday services, his voice lowered so others wouldn't hear. "Harrington practically owns Judge Cartwright. He's donated the new courthouse roof and pays for the sheriff's deputies. I'm not saying it's right, but there are powerful interests that want your land." "My husband is buried on that property," Sarah had replied. "My children were born there. I won't be bullied into selling." The pastor had sighed, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Then at least send the children to your sister in St. Louis, just until this matter is resolved." But Sarah had refused. The Miller family would stand together. It was what Thomas would have wanted. The accusations came a month later, after the body of a Double H ranch hand was found floating in the creek that ran through her property. Jeremy Tucker had been one of Harrington's most loyal men, known for handling problems that required more muscle than conscience. The official story claimed he'd been checking water levels upstream when he'd been attacked, robbed, and murdered. Sheriff Porter arrived at the Miller Ranch with 4 deputies and a warrant signed by Judge Cartwright. "This is absurd," Sarah had protested as they searched her home and questioned her frightened children. "I was here all day with Eduardo and the children. We never saw anyone near the creek." But when the search revealed Tucker's pocket watch hidden in her barn and blood-stained clothing buried behind the chicken coop, the whispers in town transformed into open accusations. Sarah recognized the items as planted evidence, but in a drought-stricken town desperate for someone to blame for their misfortunes, few were interested in her claims of innocence. The trial lasted less than a day. Judge Cartwright, a thin man with hard eyes and Harrington money in his pockets, heard testimonies from a parade of witnesses who suddenly remembered Sarah's threats against the Double H, her erratic behavior in town, her inappropriate independence as a woman managing men's affairs. Eduardo Vasquez testified to Sarah's innocence, providing a detailed account of their day working the north pasture, far from where Tucker's body was found. But when Harrington's lawyer questioned his loyalty to his American employer and suggested that perhaps the Mexican foreman had more than professional feelings for the widow, the damage was done. In 1878 Arizona Territory, a Hispanic man's word carried little weight against the territory elite. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's children Emma, age 12, James, age 10, and little Catherine, just 7, huddled together on a bench at the back of the courtroom, watching in confused terror as their mother was transformed from respected neighbor to murderous villain before their eyes. The jury finds the defendant, Sarah Elizabeth Miller, guilty of the murder of Jeremy Tucker, the foreman announced, unable to meet her gaze. Judge Cartwright's sentence came without hesitation. In light of the heinous nature of this crime and the defendant's refusal to confess, I sentence Sarah Miller to public punishment and humiliation, followed by imprisonment until such time as the territorial governor reviews her case for possible hanging. The public punishment was redemption's innovation, a revival of colonial-era practices that had no place in a civilized society, but had become increasingly common as the drought stretched nerves and patience to breaking points. Wrongdoers were tied to the post in the town square, subjected to the judgment of the community they had supposedly wronged. For thieves, it might mean a day of public ridicule. For those who failed to pay debts, it could involve confiscation of property while they watched. But for Sarah Miller, convicted murderess, the post meant something far worse. Now, as sheriff, Porter stepped away from the tightly bound widow. Judge Cartwright addressed the gathered crowd from the steps of the newly roofed courthouse. Citizens of redemption, we gather today to witness justice served on behalf of Jeremy Tucker, whose life was cut short by the greed and malice of this woman. He gestured toward Sarah, who stood straight despite her bonds, refusing to bow her head. Let this serve as a reminder that in this territory, no crime goes unpunished, regardless of the criminal's sex or station. From the edge of the crowd, Wallace Harrington watched with thinly veiled satisfaction. At 53, he had built the Double H into the largest ranch in the territory through a combination of business acumen, political connections, and methods that rarely found their way into official records. The Miller property was the final piece in his plan to control all water rights in the Eastern Valley, a plan that Sarah Miller's stubborn refusal had delayed by months. The court has authorized reasonable corporal punishment, Cartwright continued, to be followed by imprisonment. Mr. Harrington has generously offered the services of his foreman, Mr. Blake, to administer this punishment, as our sheriff is understandably reluctant to strike a woman, even one convicted of murder. At this signal, A broad-shouldered man with a face like weathered leather stepped forward from beside Harrington. Lester Blake had come up from Texas with a reputation for breaking horses and men with equal efficiency. In his hand, he carried a coiled bullwhip. A murmur ran through the crowd. While public humiliation was common, flogging was another matter. Entirely especially for a woman. Several townspeople exchanged uncomfortable glances, their bloodlust diminishing at the reality of what was about to happen. "This ain't right," muttered Henry Woodson, the blacksmith, to his wife. "Tucker wasn't worth much alive. Beating a mother in front of her kids ain't justice." "Then speak up," his wife whispered back. "Or are you afraid of losing Harrington's?" "Business too." But Henry, like the others who harbored doubts, remained silent. The drought had made everyone vulnerable, and Harrington's support could mean the difference between survival and ruin. Sheriff Porter cleared his throat. "Judge, perhaps we should remove the children before proceeding." "They needn't witness. The children will stay," Harrington interrupted, his voice carrying across the square. "Let them see what becomes of those who defy the law in redemption." Sarah's eldest daughter, Emma, stared at Harrington with undisguised hatred, her arm protectively around her younger siblings. The girl had her mother's spirit, and for a moment, Harrington wondered if he should have arranged for the children to be sent east after all. But it was too late for second thoughts. Blake uncoiled the whip with practiced ease, its length snaking across the packed earth of the town square. "Remove her jacket," he instructed the sheriff. "Can't teach a proper lesson through all that material." Porter hesitated, then stepped forward to comply, his hands shaking slightly as he unbuttoned Sarah's faded blue jacket and pulled it roughly from her shoulders, leaving her in a thin cotton blouse that provided little protection against what was to come. "Get on with it," Harrington called out, checking his pocket watch. "Some of us have ranches to run." Blake nodded and took his position, measuring the distance with cold precision. The crowd fell silent, collective breath held, in anticipation of violence. Sarah closed her eyes, steeling herself for the pain while silently praying her children would be spared witnessing her suffering. The first crack of the whip split the air like lightning. Sarah's body jerked against the post as the leather cut through her blouse and into the skin beneath. She bit her lip until it bled, determined not to cry out, not to give them the satisfaction. A thin line of crimson appeared, staining the white cotton of her blouse. Blake drew back for a second. "Strike!" But before the whip could fall again, a new sound interrupted, the thundering of approaching hoofbeats, fast and purposeful. Heads turned toward the north road as a rider appeared through the heat haze, pushing his horse to a gallop despite the afternoon sun. As he drew closer, the townsfolk could make out a tall figure on a massive black stallion, dust billowing behind them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "Who the hell is that?" Harrington demanded, squinting against the sunlight. Sheriff Porter shook his head, hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. "No idea, not one of ours." The stranger rode directly into the town square, showing no regard for the crowd that scattered before his horse's pounding hooves. He reined in hard just yards from the post where Sarah was bound, the stallion rearing dramatically before settling. For a moment, silence reclaimed the square as everyone stared at the newcomer. He sat tall in the saddle, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed black hat. A duster coat, trail-worn and dusty, hung from broad shoulders, and the butts of twin Colt revolvers gleamed at his hips. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, cold blue and filled with barely contained fury as they surveyed the scene. Before him, "What business brings you to Redemption, stranger?" Sheriff Porter called out, attempting to reassert authority over the interrupted proceedings. "We're conducting official territorial justice here." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, boots hitting the dirt with surprising lightness for a man of his size. He stood a full head taller than most men present, with shoulders that spoke of years of hard labor. As he stepped forward, The crowd instinctively backed away, creating a path between him and the whipping post. "Justice?" The stranger's voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, but it carried across the suddenly silent square. "Is that what you call beating a woman in front of her children?" Now that he stood in full sunlight, the townsfolk could see his face clearly weathered by sun and wind, with a scar running from his right temple to jawline. His beard was neatly trimmed, shot through with premature gray despite his apparent youth. He couldn't have been more than 35, yet he carried himself with the weariness of a much older man. Judge Cartwright stepped forward, puffing up his thin chest. "This woman has been convicted of murder by a jury of her peers. The punishment is both legal and appropriate. I suggest you move along before you find yourself in contempt of court." The stranger's gaze shifted to Cartwright, then to Harrington standing smugly behind him, and finally to Blake with his whip still ready. Something dangerous flickered in those blue eyes. "Murder?" he asked, voice deceptively calm. "And who did this woman supposedly kill?" "Jeremy Tucker," Harrington answered before the judge could speak. "One of my best men. Found dead on her property with his skull crushed. Her guilt was proven beyond question." The stranger nodded slowly, as though absorbing this information. Then, without warning, he smiled a cold, terrible expression that contained no humor whatsoever. "Jeremy Tucker," he repeated. "Interesting. I've been tracking a man by that name for 3 months. A man who robbed a bank in Santa Fe, killed 2 guards, and disappeared with $5,000. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, which he tossed at the sheriff's feet. Tucker had a distinctive scar on his left forearm. Knife wound shaped like a crescent moon. "Your dead man have such a mark, Sheriff?" Porter bent to retrieve the paper, unfolding it to reveal a wanted poster with a crude drawing that bore a striking resemblance to the deceased ranch hand. The description matched Tucker down to the distinctive scar, as did the list of crimes: armed robbery, murder, horse theft, and assault. This doesn't change the fact that Mrs. Miller killed him," Harrington sputtered, though a note of uncertainty had crept into his voice. "I didn't kill anyone." Sarah spoke up for the first time, her voice strained but steady. "Tucker was already dead when my foreman found him in the creek. Someone placed his body on my property, just like they planted his watch in my barn." The stranger's eyes met Sarah's, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared injustice perhaps, or simply the understanding that they both stood against forces larger than themselves. "My name is Gabriel Reeves," the stranger announced, turning back to address the crowd. "Former U.S. Marshal from the Colorado Territory. I've been hunting Tucker and his gang since they killed my partner in a jailbreak 6 months ago." A ripple of whispers spread through the gathered townsfolk. U.S. Marshals carried weight even in remote territories, and the possibility that they had been about to flog an innocent woman suddenly seemed very real. "Former Marshal?" Harrington challenged, emphasizing the word. "Where's your badge, Reeves?" Gabriel's hand moved to his chest where a badge might once have been pinned. "Turned it in after my partner died. This hunt became personal." He paused, eyes narrowing. "But I still have friends in the service who'll be mighty interested to learn how redemption administers justice. Especially when I tell them about a rancher who's willing to frame an innocent widow for murder to steal her water rights." Harrington's face flushed dark red. "That's slander. Sheriff, arrest this man." Porter made no move toward Gabriel, his hand no longer resting on his gun. Instead, he looked thoughtfully at the wanted poster, then at Sarah bleeding against the post, and finally at her children, huddled together in fear and confusion. "Perhaps," the sheriff said slowly, "in light of this new information, we should postpone Mrs. Miller's punishment pending further investigation. There's nothing to investigate." Harrington shouted, his composure cracking. "The trial is over. The verdict was rendered." "Verdicts can be overturned," Gabriel replied calmly. especially when new evidence comes to light, or when it's discovered that witnesses were coerced, evidence was planted, or judges were bought. His gaze locked with Harrington's. Tucker wasn't alone when he came to Arizona territory. He rode with two other men, both equally wanted. I tracked them this far before losing their trail. Interesting coincidence that Tucker ended up working for you, Harrington. A murmur ran through the crowd again, louder this time. Several townspeople exchanged significant glances, pieces falling into place that they had previously ignored. Harrington's hand moved toward the revolver at his hip, but before he could draw, Gabriel's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I wouldn't," he said softly. "My days with a badge might be behind me, but I haven't forgotten how to use these." His hands hovered near his holstered Colts, not touching them but making the threat clear. "And unlike some, I don't need to hire others to fight my battles." For a long moment, no one moved. The tableau held Sarah bound and bleeding at the post, her children watching wide-eyed. Gabriel standing like an avenging angel in the center of the square. Harrington, the judge, and Blake caught between rage and calculation. And the townsfolk, whose thirst for spectacle had been replaced by uncomfortable self-reflection. It was young Emma Miller who broke the silence, darting from her sibling's side toward her mother with desperate determination. Before anyone could stop her, she had reached Sarah and thrown her arms around her, sobbing against her torn blouse. "Please don't hurt my mama anymore," she cried, her voice carrying across the square. "She didn't do anything wrong." The sight of the child embracing her bleeding mother sent a visible shudder through the crowd. Mothers turned away, unable to watch. Men shuffled their feet, suddenly fascinated by the dirt beneath their boots. Gabriel stepped forward deliberately, until he stood between Harrington and the Miller family. "Someone cut her down," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Now." Sheriff Porter moved first, drawing his knife and approaching the post. Harrington started to protest but fell silent when he realized how the mood of the crowd had shifted. With quick slices, Porter cut through the ropes binding Sarah to the post. She sagged forward, caught between her daughter's small arms and the sheriff's reluctant support. "This isn't over," Harrington hissed, but his words lacked conviction. "You're right about that," Gabriel agreed, his voice carrying so all could hear. "It's just beginning. By sundown, I want Tucker's real killers identified. By tomorrow, I expect Mrs. Miller's name to be cleared completely." His eyes swept over the judge, the sheriff, and finally Harrington. "And if I discover anyone attempting to leave town before this matter is resolved, I'll consider it an admission of guilt." Judge Cartwright sputtered indignantly. "You have no authority here, Reeves. You can't simply—" "I can and I will," Gabriel cut him off. "Or would you prefer I send telegrams to the territorial governor and the current U.S. Marshal explaining how Redemption's justice system operates? I imagine they'd be very interested in reviewing all your recent cases, Judge." Cartwright's face drained of color. Like many frontier judges, his record wouldn't withstand serious scrutiny, especially from territorial authorities looking to impress Washington with their commitment to proper judicial procedure. Gabriel turned his attention to Sarah, his expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Miller, is there somewhere safe you and your children can stay while this matter is investigated properly?" Sarah straightened, wincing at the movement but determined to stand on her own. "My ranch is 5 miles east of town. My foreman and hands are loyal. They know I'm innocent." "Good. I'll escort you home." Gabriel glanced at the sheriff. "I trust you'll begin a proper investigation, Porter, starting with checking Tucker's arm for that distinctive scar and determining who else might have wanted him dead." Porter nodded. Grudgingly, "I'll look into it." "And I'll help," offered Henry Woodson, the blacksmith, stepping forward from the crowd. "Sarah Miller's husband was my friend. I should have spoken up sooner." Others began to nod in agreement, courage finding purchase now that someone had taken the first step. The mood of the crowd had transformed completely, shifting from bloodthirsty anticipation to shame and a desperate desire to make amends. Harrington looked around at the changing faces of the townsfolk and recognized defeat, at least for the moment. With a curt nod to Blake, he turned and strode away, already calculating his next move. Gabriel helped Sarah to his horse, lifting her gently into the saddle despite her protests that she could walk. Her children crowded around, James and Catherine clinging to Gabriel's duster, while Emma maintained her protective stance. "Why?" Sarah asked quietly as Gabriel prepared to lead the horse out of town. "Why would you help a stranger this way?" Gabriel's eyes met hers, and for an instant, the hardness in them gave way to something else, an old pain, carefully guarded but never fully healed. "Let's just say I recognize injustice when I see it," he replied. "And I've seen too much of it go unanswered." As they moved slowly out of the town square, the gathered crowd parted before them, many lowering their eyes in shame. Gabriel Reeves had indeed silenced the town, but it was the quiet of awakening conscience rather than fear. Behind them, Sheriff Porter stared thoughtfully at the wanted poster in his hand, then at Harrington's retreating back. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the badge on his chest and remembered the oath he had taken when he first pinned it there. At the edge of town, Gabriel Reeves looked back at the weathered buildings and dusty streets of Redemption. Something told him that the town's troubles and his own involvement in them were just beginning. The same instinct that had guided him through years as a marshal whispered that Tucker's death was merely one thread in a much larger web of corruption and violence. Sarah Miller watched him from her perch on his horse, reading the calculation in his expression. "It's not over, is it?" she asked softly, mindful of her children walking beside them. Gabriel shook his head slightly. "Justice rarely comes easily, Mrs. Miller, or quickly. Sarah," she corrected him. "After what you've done today, I think we're well past formalities." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Sarah, then." As they continued down the east road toward the Miller Ranch, the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows before them. Behind them, the town of Redemption seemed smaller somehow, its power diminished by one man's refusal to look away from injustice. What neither Gabriel nor Sarah could know was that their confrontation in the town square had set in motion events that would change the territory forever, and that the alliance forged that day between a former marshal and a wrongfully accused widow would become the stuff of frontier legend. The sun had already dipped below the distant mountains by the time Gabriel Reeves led Sarah Miller and her children to the safety of their ranch. The modest two-story house stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, windows glowing with welcoming lamplight. Eduardo Vasquez and two ranch hands rushed from the barn as they approached, rifles ready. "Senora Miller!" Eduardo called out, his weathered face creasing with concern as he caught sight of Sarah's bloodied blouse. "Dios mío, what have they done to you?" "I'm all right, Eduardo," Sarah assured him, though the pain in her back told a different story. Gabriel helped her dismount carefully, supporting her weight as her feet touched the ground. "This is Mr. Reeves. He intervened before things got worse." Eduardo nodded respectfully to Gabriel, recognition dawning in his eyes. "I have heard of you, Senator Reeves. Stories travel, even to places like this." Gabriel's expression remained neutral, revealing neither confirmation nor denial of whatever tales Eduardo might have heard. "Your employer needs medical attention. The children need food and rest. Then we need to talk." The foreman immediately took charge, directing one of the hands to stable Gabriel's stallion while he personally helped Sarah into the house. Emma Miller remained glued to her mother's side, while the younger children regarded Gabriel with a mixture of fear and cautious hope. "Are you really a marshal?" 10-year-old James asked, falling into step beside the tall stranger. "Was," Gabriel corrected, shortening his stride to match the boys. "Not anymore, but you still help people?" Gabriel glanced down at the child, seeing earnest eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of another boy from long ago. "Sometimes when I can." Inside the ranch house, oil lamps cast a warm glow over simple but well-maintained furnishings. Family. Photographs lined the mantel above a stone fireplace, and books filled a small shelf in the corner. It was a home, not just a house, a place where a family had built a life together. Sarah insisted on seeing her children fed and settled before allowing anyone to tend to her wounds. Gabriel observed her quiet strength with growing respect. Most women, most men, for that matter, would have collapsed after what she had endured. Today. But Sarah Miller moved through her home with purpose, comforting her children and giving instructions to her housekeeper, as though returning from an ordinary trip to town. Only when the children were eating at the kitchen table did she finally permit herself to be led to a side room where the housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, had prepared hot water, clean cloths, and medicinal supplies. "I should check for riders," Gabriel said, turning toward the door. "Harrington strikes me as the type who might send men to finish what he started." Sarah nodded, understanding his concern. "Eduardo has already doubled the watch. We've been expecting trouble since the trial." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you, Mr. Reeves, what you did today." "Don't thank me yet," Gabriel interrupted, his voice low so the children wouldn't overhear. "Harrington won't give up so easily. This is just the beginning." Outside, Gabriel found Eduardo organizing the ranch's defenses with the efficiency of a military campaign. The Mexican foreman had positioned men at strategic points around the property, established signals, and prepared fallback positions should the house itself come under attack. "You've done this before," Gabriel observed. Eduardo nodded grimly. "Army of Juarez, before I came north." He checked the loading of his rifle with practiced hands. "Senator Miller was a good man. He gave me work when others would not. His widow and children, they are my family now." Gabriel understood. Loyalty like Eduardo's couldn't be bought. It had to be earned. "Tell me about Tucker." "The man Mrs. Miller was accused of killing." Eduardo spat on the ground. "A snake. He came to work for Harrington 6 months ago. Always watching the Miller property, looking for weaknesses. 3 weeks ago, he threatened Senora Miller in town, said her children might have accidents if she didn't sell to Harrington." "Did the sheriff know about these threats?" "We reported them." Eduardo's expression darkened. "Sheriff Porter said without witnesses, nothing could be done. Called it just talk." Gabriel wasn't surprised. Throughout the territories, law enforcement often served the interests of the powerful rather than justice. "And the body? You found it?" "See." Eduardo's eyes narrowed at the memory. "In the creek, just inside our property line. Already dead for hours. The head," he made a crushing motion with his hands. "Very bad. I told Senora Miller to stay back, but she insisted on seeing. She recognized him immediately. And no one saw or heard anything unusual that night." Eduardo shook his head. "We were all at the north pasture that day, fixing fence lines broken by Harrington's cattle. Convenient, no? The one day no one is near the creek." The pieces were falling into place in Gabriel's mind, forming a picture all too familiar from his years wearing a badge. A powerful man wanting land, a stubborn owner refusing to sell, escalating pressure. Then murder and a convenient scapegoat. He had seen the pattern played out across Colorado, Nevada, and now Arizona territory. "Tucker didn't work alone," Gabriel said. "The wanted poster says he rode with 2 other men. Any strangers working for Harrington besides Tucker?" Eduardo considered the question. 2 men arrived with Tucker. "Brothers, I think. Davis is their name. Frank and Roy. Very quiet, keep to themselves. They handle Harrington's special tasks, the Davis brothers." Gabriel's jaw tightened. They had been part of Tucker's gang during the Santa Fe robbery, though. They had escaped before Gabriel could identify them. If they were working for Harrington, it confirmed his suspicions that Tucker's presence in Redemption was no coincidence. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Abernathy, who appeared at the back door wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Reeves, Senator Vasquez, Mrs. Miller would like to speak with you both." They found Sarah seated at her kitchen table, dressed in a clean blouse, her back bandaged beneath it. The children had been sent upstairs, though Gabriel suspected they weren't sleeping. Emma, at least, was probably listening from the top of the stairs, determined to protect her mother however she could. "Lester Blake's whip left marks," Sarah said without preamble, "but I'll heal. More importantly, we need to discuss what happens next." Gabriel leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Harrington will have to tread carefully for a few days. The town saw what happened. But once the initial shock wears off, he'll try again. Men like him don't abandon what they want." "And what does he want?" Sarah asked. "Is it really just my water rights? There are other properties with better access." "It's not just water," Eduardo interjected. 2 months ago, a geological survey team came through the valley. They spent 3 days on your property, especially near the eastern ridge." Gabriel straightened. "Survey team? Government?" Eduardo shook his head. "Private. They claim to be updating territorial maps, but they took many samples of rock and soil." "Minerals," Gabriel said, the final piece clicking into place. "Gold or silver, probably. Harrington must have gotten word of a possible deposit on your land." Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. That would explain his sudden interest. Thomas always said these hills might contain ore deposits, but he was more interested in cattle than mining. If Harrington found evidence of a significant strike, he'd do anything to acquire your property before you discovered its true value, Gabriel explained, including murder and framing you for it. The implications hung in the air between them. A mining claim could be worth thousands, even millions of dollars, more than enough to justify extreme measures in the eyes of a man like Wallace Harrington. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked. "I won't sell, not even with this new information. This land is my children's legacy." Gabriel considered their options. His original mission had been tracking Tucker and bringing him to justice, a goal rendered impossible by the man's death. But the Davis brothers were still alive, still working for Harrington, and still answerable for their crimes in Santa Fe. "We need proof," he said finally. "Proof that Harrington orchestrated Tucker's murder. Proof that the Davis brothers were involved. And proof of why he wants your land so badly." "And how do we get this proof?" Sarah asked. Gabriel's expression hardened. "I'm going back to town, tonight." Eduardo and Sarah exchanged concerned glances. "Alone?" the foreman asked. "Against Harrington and his men?" "I work better alone," Gabriel replied. "And I'm not planning to confront anyone. Not yet. I just need information." Sarah studied him thoughtfully. "You've been doing this a long time, haven't you? Hunting men like Tucker, like Harrington." Gabriel didn't answer directly. "Get some rest, Mrs. Miller. Keep your people alert. I'll return before dawn." As he turned to leave, Sarah called after him. "The wanted poster you showed in town, was it real?" Gabriel paused in the doorway. "Real enough. Tucker was wanted for the Santa Fe robbery. The Davis brothers were with him." He hesitated, then added, "But I wasn't tracking him for that. He and his gang killed my partner during a jailbreak in Tucson. Shot him in the back while he was protecting a female prisoner." Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. "So this is personal for you." "Justice is always personal, Mrs. Miller. Anyone who says different is lying." With that, Gabriel disappeared into the darkness, the night swallowing him as completely as if he had never been there at all. The town of Redemption was mostly dark when Gabriel arrived 2 hours later, having circled around to approach from the west, rather than the road from the Miller Ranch. A few lights still burned in saloon windows, and the occasional drunken laugh echoed down the empty streets, but most citizens had retired for the night, perhaps to sleep off the day's unexpected drama. Gabriel left his horse tethered at the edge of town and proceeded on foot, keeping to shadows and moving with a silence born of years tracking fugitives through hostile territory. His first destination was the sheriff's office, where a single lamp burned in the front window. The door was unlocked, and Gabriel slipped inside to find Sheriff Porter seated at his desk, a bottle of whiskey and a half-empty glass before him. The lawman looked up, startled, then relaxed marginally when he recognized his visitor. "Figured you might come back," Porter said, reaching for the bottle. "Want a drink?" Gabriel shook his head. "Information is all I want, Sheriff. Starting with the truth about Jeremy Tucker's death." Porter sighed heavily and poured himself another 2 fingers of whiskey. "Truth? The truth is I'm a coward, Reeves. Have been for years. It's easier to look the other way when Harrington throws his weight around. Safer. For you, maybe. Not for Sarah Miller." Porter had the decency to look ashamed. "I never thought it would go that far. A fine, maybe. Some jail time, not." He trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward the town square where the whipping post stood. "Tell me about Tucker," Gabriel pressed. "Did you check for the scar I mentioned?" Porter nodded reluctantly. "It was there, just like on your poster. Crescent-shaped knife scar on his left forearm." He took a long swallow of whiskey. "Doesn't prove Mrs. Miller didn't kill him, though." "No," Gabriel agreed. "But it does prove he wasn't the upstanding ranch hand Harrington made him out to be. Tucker was a killer, Porter. He and the Davis brothers robbed the Territorial Bank in Santa Fe 6 months ago. Killed 2 guards and a teller. Then they broke out of jail in Tucson, killing my partner in the process." Porter's eyes widened slightly. "The Davis brothers? Frank and Roy? They work for Harrington, too." "Exactly. 3 known criminals suddenly appearing in redemption, all working for the same man. Coincidence?" The sheriff stared into his glass. "Harrington's land deals have always been aggressive, but murder? I don't know, Reeves." "Then help me find out," Gabriel said. "What do you know about geological surveys on the Miller property?" Porter's reaction confirmed Gabriel's suspicions. The sheriff's eyes flickered momentarily toward a drawer in his desk before he controlled his expression. "Don't know anything about that." Gabriel moved with lightning speed, pulling the drawer open before Porter could stop him. Inside lay a folded document bearing the seal of the Arizona Territorial Mining Authority. Gabriel scanned it quickly, his suspicions confirmed. Estimated gold deposits worth $300,000 to $500,000, he read aloud. Preliminary claim registered by Wallace Harrington. Pending property acquisition. He looked up at Porter, disgust evident in his expression. He already filed a mining claim on land he doesn't own. "And you knew about it?" Porter spread his hands helplessly. "Harrington said it was just preparation. That Mrs. Miller had agreed to sell but wanted to wait until after the spring cattle drive to finalize the deal. And you believe that? Or did you just not care as long as your pockets stayed lined?" Gabriel folded the document and tucked it inside his coat. "This is evidence of conspiracy, Sheriff. Evidence that Harrington had a $500,000 motive to get rid of Sarah Miller." "You can't take that," Porter protested weakly. "It's an official document." "I'm sure the territorial governor will be very interested to see it," Gabriel replied, "along with my report of how justice is administered in redemption." The sheriff's face paled. "Harrington will kill me if he finds out I let you take that. Then I suggest you start remembering which side of the law you're supposed to be on." Gabriel moved toward the door, then paused. "Where are the Davis brothers staying? They weren't in town today." "Harrington sent them to his South Ranch yesterday," Porter admitted. "Said he needed them to handle some business there. Or to keep them away from the public spectacle of Sarah's punishment." Gabriel thought. The South Ranch was Harrington's most isolated property, a perfect place to hide men who might be recognized from wanted posters. "One more thing," Gabriel said. "Tucker's autopsy. Who performed it?" "Doc Wilson." But Harrington was there the whole time, watching over his shoulder, which meant the official cause of death might not reflect reality. Gabriel would need to speak with the doctor directly. His next stop was the small house at the edge of town that served as both Dr. Wilson's residence and medical office. Unlike the sheriff, the doctor was genuinely surprised when Gabriel materialized in his study. "Good Lord," Wilson exclaimed, nearly dropping the medical journal. He had been reading. "How did you get in here?" "Your back door needs better locks, Doctor," Gabriel replied calmly. "I need information about Jeremy Tucker's death." Wilson was a small, nervous man with spectacles perched on a prominent nose. "I've already provided my official findings to the court. Mr. Tucker died from blunt force trauma to the skull. The weapon was never recovered." "I'm more interested in your unofficial findings," Gabriel said. "The details you might have omitted when Harrington was watching." The doctor hesitated, clearly torn between professional ethics and fear. "I could lose my practice for discussing this." "You could lose more if I decide you helped frame an innocent woman for murder," Gabriel countered. Wilson removed his spectacles and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Very well. The official report states that Tucker was killed by a single blow to the head, likely from behind. But that wasn't the whole truth." "Go on." "The wound pattern was inconsistent with human assault," Wilson explained. "The damage was too extensive, too distributed, and there were wood splinters embedded in the wound." Gabriel leaned forward, interest sharpening. "What kind of wood?" "Pine, I believe, fresh cut." "Could it have been from a falling tree branch? An accident rather than murder?" Wilson nodded reluctantly. "That would be consistent with the injuries. A large branch falling from sufficient height could certainly cause fatal damage of that nature." "And did you share this theory with Sheriff Porter?" "I tried," Wilson admitted. But Harrington interrupted, suggested that Mrs. Miller could have used a wooden club of some kind. Once he fixed on that idea, no one wanted to consider alternatives. Gabriel absorbed this information, adding it to the growing picture in his mind. "Thank you, Doctor. You've been more helpful than you know." His final destination for the night was the most dangerous, Harrington's townhouse, a two-story structure on the only paved street in Redemption. Unlike the sheriff's office or the doctor's home, this building would be guarded, especially after the day's events. Gabriel observed from the shadows of an alley across the street, counting 3 men patrolling the perimeter. 2 more were visible through windows on the ground floor. Harrington himself was likely upstairs, where lights still burned despite the late hour. Direct entry would be impossible without confrontation, which Gabriel wanted to avoid. But there was another way to gather information. He circled the block to where the house's stables backed onto a narrow service alley. Here, a single guard stood smoking a cigarette, clearly bored with his assignment. Gabriel waited until the man turned to flick ash from his smoke, then moved. His hand clamped over the guard's mouth while his other arm locked around the man's throat in a precise hold that cut off blood flow to the brain without restricting air. Within seconds, the guard went limp. Gabriel eased him to the ground, checking to ensure he was merely unconscious rather than dead. Then he relieved the man of his gun and tied him securely with his own belt. The stable was dark and quiet, 4 horses resting in their stalls. Gabriel moved past them to the small room at the rear where the stable hand would sleep. As he expected, the room was empty, the stable hand likely drafted into guard duty given the night's heightened security. What interested Gabriel was not the room itself but what lay beyond it, a narrow passageway connecting the stable to the main house, allowing servants to move between buildings in bad weather without going outside. Many wealthy homes included such features, a fact Gabriel had exploited more than once in his career. The passage led to the house's kitchen, which was mercifully empty at this late hour. Gabriel could hear voices from the front rooms, Harrington, and several men engaged in heated discussion. He moved silently to the doorway, positioning himself to listen without being seen. "The situation is salvageable," Harrington was saying, his tone clipped with barely controlled anger. "Reeves is one man. Once he leaves, we can proceed as planned." "But he took something from your office," another voice objected. "Some document. Porter sent word an hour ago." Gabriel smiled grimly. The sheriff had made his choice, it seemed. The mining claim? Harrington sounded genuinely alarmed for the first time. "Damn it all to hell. If that reaches the territorial authorities, before we secure the Miller property, we could just kill her," suggested a third voice, colder than the others. "Make it look like an accident. The children too, if necessary. With no heirs, the property would go to auction." There was a long pause. Gabriel's hand moved to his Colt, ready to intervene if Harrington agreed to this monstrous suggestion. "No," Harrington said finally. "No more deaths, not yet. It would raise too many questions after today's spectacle. We need a different approach." "Such as?" the cold voice asked. "The law," Harrington replied. "Mrs. Miller was convicted of murder. That conviction stands, regardless of Reeves's theatrics. Judge Cartwright can order her children made wards of the court due to their mother's criminal status. Without her children, she have no reason to keep fighting for the land." "And the former marshal?" "Find out everything about him," Harrington ordered. "Every weakness, every vulnerability, every sin from his past. No man is without secrets, gentlemen. Discover Reeves's, and we'll use them to neutralize him." Gabriel had heard enough. Quietly, he retraced his steps through the kitchen and servants' passage out to the stable where the guard still lay unconscious. He considered his options. The mining claim document in his pocket provided proof of Harrington's motive. The doctor's testimony about Tucker's injuries suggested an accident rather than murder. But it still wasn't enough to completely exonerate Sarah or to bring Harrington down. He needed more. He needed the Davis brothers. Dawn was breaking as Gabriel returned to the Miller ranch, the eastern sky painted in shades of pink and gold that belied the darkness of human affairs below. Eduardo met him at the gate, rifle ready until he recognized the rider. "Any trouble?" Gabriel asked as they rode toward the house. "Quiet night," Eduardo confirmed. "Too quiet, perhaps. No one has come from town, not even a messenger." Gabriel nodded, unsurprised. Harrington is regrouping, planning his next move. He dismounted, his body stiff from the night's exertions. "Where is Mrs. Miller?" "In the kitchen with the children." She insisted on maintaining normal routines. Inside, Sarah was indeed attempting to create a sense of normalcy, serving breakfast to her children while Mrs. Abernathy kneaded bread, dough for the day's baking. She looked up as Gabriel entered, her eyes quickly scanning his appearance for signs of confrontation or injury. "You're back," she said, relief evident in her voice despite her attempt at casualness. "I told you I would be," Gabriel replied, accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Abernathy pressed into his hands. "We need to talk." "Privately," Sarah nodded, turning to her eldest daughter. "Emma, please make sure James and Catherine finish their breakfast. Then help them with their chores." The girl glanced between her mother and Gabriel, clearly reluctant to leave, but understanding the importance of the conversation to come. "Yes, Mama." In Thomas Miller's former study, Gabriel laid out what he had discovered, the mining claim. Showing Harrington's true motive, the doctor's suppressed findings about Tucker's death, and Harrington's chilling plans for separating Sarah from her children. Sarah listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each revelation. When Gabriel finished, she rose and moved to the window, looking out at the land that had become both her family's legacy and the source of their peril. "So Tucker's death might have been an accident after all," she said finally. "A falling branch. Not murder." "It fits the evidence better than the prosecution's theory," Gabriel confirmed. "But proving it won't be easy. We need someone who knows the truth to testify." "The Davis brothers," Gabriel nodded. "If they were involved in covering up an accident to frame you, they might be persuaded to confess. Especially if the alternative is facing charges for the Santa Fe robbery." Sarah turned back to face him, determination hardening her features. "Then we need to find them. Eduardo said they're at Harrington's South Ranch, according to Sheriff Porter. But approaching them, there would be suicide. Harrington will have the place heavily guarded." "Then what do you suggest?" Gabriel's eyes held a cold certainty that Sarah was beginning to recognize. "We draw them out. Make them come to us, on our terms." "How?" "By giving Harrington what he wants." Seeing Sarah's alarmed expression, Gabriel clarified, "Or rather, making him believe he's getting what he wants." Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. "A trap, Lee." "Exactly. But it will be dangerous, especially for you." Sarah straightened, ignoring the pain from her healing wounds. "Mr. Reeves, I faced a whipping post yesterday, believing I might die there. My children have already lost their father. I won't let them lose their home too, or their mother. Whatever your plan is, I'm ready." Gabriel studied her for a long moment, his respect for this frontier widow growing. He had met hardened lawmen with less courage than Sarah Miller displayed now, facing not just physical danger, but the potential loss of everything she held dear. "Very well," he said finally. "Here's what we're going to do." Outside the study window, the sun climbed higher over the Arizona landscape, bathing the Miller Ranch in golden light. A new day had begun, one that would either see justice restored or witness the final triumph of corruption over truth. For Sarah Miller and Gabriel Reeves, former U.S. Marshal turned avenging angel, the real battle was just beginning. The plan unfolded with the precision of a well-oiled machine over the next 24 hours. First, a telegram was sent to the territorial capital in Prescott, addressed to the governor himself and bearing Gabriel's signature as a former U.S. Marshal. The message was deliberately vague, requesting an official review of judicial proceedings in redemption without specifying details. It wasn't enough to trigger immediate action, but it would create nervous anticipation among Harrington and his allies. Next, Gabriel dispatched Eduardo on a visible journey to the nearest army outpost, carrying sealed documents and writing openly. Through redemption to ensure the trip would be reported to Harrington. The documents were merely blank papers, but Harrington wouldn't know that. He would only see the Miller Ranch establishing communication with federal authorities. Finally, Sarah herself sent a message to Judge Cartwright, requesting a private meeting to discuss terms regarding her property. The bait was set. Now they needed only to wait for Harrington to snap at it. "He'll send someone to intercept Eduardo," Gabriel predicted as they sat around the kitchen table that evening, mapping out contingencies. "Probably the Davis brothers, since they're his most trusted men. But he'll also respond to your meeting request, Mrs. Miller. He'll want to know what you're planning." Sarah nodded, understanding her role in what was to come. "And when Judge Cartwright conveys my offer to sell the ranch in exchange for dropped charges, Harrington will be suspicious, but too greedy to refuse." "Exactly. He'll insist on meeting you personally, away from town, to finalize the deal. Which is when you'll make your move against the Davis brothers," Sarah concluded. "While Harrington is distracted with me." Gabriel's expression darkened. "I don't like using you as bait, especially with your children to consider." "My children are precisely why I'm doing this," Sarah replied firmly. "If we don't stop Harrington now, they'll never be safe. None of us will." The children in question had been sent to stay with Pastor Williams and his wife for the duration of the operation. Despite his earlier silence during Sarah's trial, The pastor had been genuinely shocked by the town's treatment of the widow, and had offered his home as sanctuary for the Miller children. It wasn't ideal, but it was safer than keeping them at the ranch during what promised to be dangerous days ahead. As predicted, Eduardo reported being followed as soon as he left town limits. 2 riders had maintained their distance, but tracked his movements across the open terrain toward Fort McDowell. Gabriel recognized Eduardo's description of the men immediately. The Davis brothers had taken the bait. They'll wait until nightfall to make their move, he told Eduardo. Find a place to camp within sight of the trail, somewhere with good visibility. Make it look like you're settling in for the night, but be ready to move at my signal. Eduardo nodded, understanding the plan. As Harrington's men closed in on the foreman, Gabriel would be closing in on them. Meanwhile, Sarah received word that Judge Cartwright had agreed to meet her the following morning at his private office behind the courthouse. As expected, the judge had immediately informed Harrington of this development. Remember, Gabriel cautioned her as she prepared for the meeting, your only goal is to convince them you're desperate enough to sell. The fear won't be hard to fake, just channel what you felt at that post. Sarah's eyes flashed with momentary anger. I don't need acting lessons, Mr. Reeves. I've been hiding my fear from my children for 2 years since their father died. I know how to project what others expect to see. Gabriel accepted the rebuke with a slight nod. Of course, I apologize. Their gazes held for a moment longer than necessary, an unspoken current passing between them. In the days since Gabriel's arrival, something had shifted in their relationship. What had begun as a chance intervention had evolved into a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared sense of justice. For a man who had spent years alone, tracking killers across the frontier, and a woman who had faced the solitary burden of maintaining a ranch and raising children without support, this newfound alliance was both unfamiliar and oddly comforting. Dawn broke clear and cold over the eastern mountains as Sarah prepared to ride into redemption. She wore her best-dressed navy blue with a modest lace collar and had arranged her dark hair in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. To anyone watching, she would appear to be a respectable widow on business, not a woman setting a trap for the man who had nearly destroyed her life. The Davis brothers left their camp an hour ago, one of the ranch hands reported, returning from his scouting position, heading south toward where Eduardo was last seen. Gabriel nodded, checking his revolvers one final time before securing them in their holsters. Right on schedule. Mrs. Miller, are you ready? Sarah straightened her shoulders, ignoring the twinges of pain from her healing back. As ready as I'll ever be. Remember, I won't be far. If Harrington tries anything. I know, Sarah interrupted gently. Trust me, Mr. Reeves. I have as much at stake here as you do. Gabriel studied her face, finding nothing but determination in her clear eyes. Then let's finish this. They rode separate paths toward their destinations, Sarah toward town, and her meeting with the judge, Gabriel, toward the southern hills where the Davis brothers were hunting Eduardo. The day's events would determine not just Sarah's fate, but the future of redemption itself. Justice, so long perverted in this small frontier town, might finally be restored. Judge Cartwright's private office was more lavish than his public chambers, featuring imported furniture and expensive artwork that his judicial salary could never have covered. Sarah noted these details as she was ushered in by a clerk who regarded her with poorly disguised contempt. Mrs. Miller, Cartwright greeted her with false warmth, rising from behind an ornate desk. I must say, I was surprised by your request for a meeting, given recent events. Recent events are precisely why I'm here, Judge. Sarah remained standing, declining the offered chair with a slight shake of her head. I've come to discuss terms. Cartwright's eyebrows rose. Terms? I'm not sure I understand. Your conviction stands despite the theatrical interruption of proceedings. I'm aware of my legal position, Sarah replied coolly. I'm also aware that what Wallace Harrington wants is my land, not my imprisonment or death." A flicker of unease crossed Cartwright's face at her directness. "Mr. Harrington has no influence over judicial matters, I assure you." Sarah allowed herself a small knowing smile. "Please, Judge, let's not waste time with pretenses. Harrington wants my ranch for its mineral deposits. I want my freedom and my children's security. Surely we can reach an arrangement beneficial to all parties." Cartwright studied her for a long moment, then moved to a side door and opened it. As Sarah had expected, Wallace Harrington himself stepped through, his expression a careful mask of neutrality. "Mrs. Miller," he said, inclining his head slightly, "I understand you wish to discuss business. Mr. Harrington, how convenient that you happened to be next door during my private meeting with the judge." Harrington's smile didn't reach his eyes. "In a town this size, convenience abounds. I believe you mentioned terms." Sarah took a steadying breath, then launched into the speech she and Gabriel had carefully prepared. "I'm willing to sell you my ranch, all 640 acres, for a fair price. In exchange, I want all charges against me dropped, a public statement clearing my name, and enough money to relocate my family far from Arizona territory." "That's quite a list of demands from a convicted murderess," Harrington observed, his tone deceptively light. "A murderess who happens to possess documentation of gold deposits on her property," Sarah countered. "Documentation that certain parties have tried very hard to keep secret." Harrington's composure slipped momentarily, his eyes narrowing. "What documentation?" "The kind that would interest the Territorial Mining Authority greatly, especially if they learned a claim had been filed before the property was legally acquired." Sarah maintained steady eye contact, forcing herself not to look away despite the cold anger building in Harrington's expression. "Where is this documentation now?" he demanded. "Safe," Sarah replied simply, "as is additional evidence suggesting Jeremy Tucker died accidentally rather than by murder. A falling tree branch, I believe, according to the doctor's actual findings." Judge Cartwright paled visibly, while Harrington's face flushed with anger. "You've been busy, Mrs. Miller. Or rather, your new friend Mr. Reeves has. Does it matter who uncovered the truth? What matters is what happens next." Sarah maintained her composure, though her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. "I'm offering you a simple transaction, Mr. Harrington. The land you want in exchange for my family's freedom and future. One signature, and we both get what we need." Harrington's calculating mind was visibly at work behind his eyes, weighing options and risks. "And if I refuse?" "Then the territorial governor receives a complete file containing the mining claim, the doctor's suppressed findings, and sworn statements from multiple witnesses regarding Tucker's threats against me prior to his death." Sarah straightened, channeling all her genuine determination into her performance. "I have nothing left to lose, Mr. Harrington. You've seen to that. But you have a reputation, business interests, political ambitions. How would they survive such a scandal?" The gambit was working. Harrington's expression shifted from anger to wary consideration. "Let's say I'm interested. How would this transaction proceed?" "I have papers prepared. We meet at my ranch this afternoon, sign the transfer documents, and you pay me in cash. Judge Cartwright officially vacates the conviction, and by sunset, my children and I are on the stage to California." "Your ranch," Harrington repeated thoughtfully. "Not here in town." "My terms, Mr. Harrington, my property until the papers are signed." Harrington exchanged a glance with Cartwright, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Very well, Mrs. Miller. 4 o'clock at your ranch. Bring the documentation you claim to have, and I'll bring the cash. $20,000. For the entire property." $40,000, Sarah countered without hesitation. "The gold deposits alone are worth 10 times that amount." "30, Harrington replied. "Final offer." Sarah pretended to consider this, then nodded. $30,000 in cash, plus all charges dropped and a written statement clearing my name. Done. Harrington extended his hand, and Sarah forced herself to take it, suppressing a shudder at the contact. His palm was soft, uncalloused, the hand of a man who ordered others to commit his violence for him. As Sarah left the courthouse, she could feel Harrington's eyes following her, calculating and cold. The first phase of their plan had succeeded. Now everything depended on Gabriel and his pursuit of the Davis brothers. Miles away, Gabriel Reeves crouched among the rocks, overlooking a narrow arroyo where the Davis brothers had made camp. The men had been tracking Eduardo's trail since dawn, believing themselves to be the hunters rather than the hunted. Gabriel had paralleled their route, keeping to higher ground and using his field glass to monitor their progress. From his vantage point, he could see Frank and Roy Davis clearly too lean, hard-faced men whose matching red bandanas identified them as the brothers from the Santa Fe robbery. They moved with the practiced coordination of men accustomed to working together in dangerous situations, one always watching while the other scouted ahead. What they didn't know was that Eduardo had long since doubled back, circling around to join Gabriel. The tracks they followed now were deliberately laid false trails designed to lead them into this perfect ambush position, a narrow canyon with steep walls and only one practical exit. "They are good," Eduardo observed quietly from beside Gabriel. "But not good enough." Gabriel nodded in agreement. "They're expecting to ambush you, not to be ambushed themselves. That makes them careless." He checked his revolvers once more. "Remember the plan. I need at least one of them alive and talking. And if they refuse to surrender?" Gabriel's expression hardened. "Then they face the same justice they dispense to others, but I'm hoping they're smarter than that." Below, the Davis brothers had paused at a fork in the canyon, examining the tracks that Eduardo had carefully laid the previous day. They conferred briefly, then separated, one following the tracks deeper into the canyon while the other remained at the junction, presumably as a safeguard against ambush. "They're splitting up," Gabriel observed. "Perfect. I'll take the one heading into the canyon. You circle around and cover the other one, but don't engage unless necessary." Eduardo nodded and moved silently away, working his way around the rim of the canyon to establish a position above the second brother. Gabriel, meanwhile, descended carefully toward the canyon floor, using the abundant scrub brush and rock formations for cover. Roy Davis, the younger and more impulsive of the brothers, according to Gabriel's intelligence, was following Eduardo's false trail with growing frustration, clearly aware that something wasn't right about the tracks. He paused repeatedly, scanning the canyon walls with narrowed eyes, hand never straying far from his holstered revolver. Gabriel shadowed him from 20 yards back, moving only when the sound of the wind or Roy's own footsteps would mask any noise. When Roy rounded a bend that concealed him from his brother's view, Gabriel made his move. "Don't reach for it," he said quietly, his Colt suddenly pressed against the back of Roy's head. "Not unless you want your brother to find your brains decorating these rocks." Roy froze, his hand halfway to his gun. "Who the hell?" "Gabriel Reeves, former U.S. Marshal. You and I have unfinished business from Santa Fe, Roy." The younger Davis brothers' shoulders slumped slightly as recognition set in. Should have known Tucker's death would bring trouble. Smart observation. "Now very slowly, use 2 fingers to remove your gun and drop it. Then we're going to have a friendly chat about Jeremy Tucker, Wallace Harrington, and a certain land grab involving the Miller Ranch." Roy hesitated, perhaps calculating his odds of drawing and firing before Gabriel could react. Whatever he saw in those odds apparently discouraged him, as he carefully extracted his revolver with thumb and forefinger and let it fall to the ground. "Frank won't talk," Roy warned as Gabriel quickly bound his wrists with rawhide strips. "No matter what you do to him." "Then it's fortunate I have you instead," Gabriel replied. Younger brothers are often more reasonable. Now move nice and quiet. They made their way back toward the canyon entrance, Gabriel keeping Roy ahead of him with the Colt pressed firmly against the outlaw's spine. As they approached the junction where Frank waited, Gabriel whistled, a high, clear note that signaled Eduardo to make his move. From his position above, Eduardo fired a single shot that kicked up dust inches from Frank Davis's feet. The older brother dove for cover, drawing his weapon as he rolled behind a boulder. "Frank Davis!" Gabriel called. "Out. I have your brother. Throw out your gun and stand up, or Roy gets a bullet through his spine." "He's bluffing, Frank," Roy shouted. "Don't," Gabriel silenced him with a sharp jab of the gun barrel. "I never bluff, Roy. You should tell your brother that." There was a long pause from behind the boulder, then Frank's voice floated back. "How do I know Roy's even alive?" "Tell him something only you would know," Gabriel instructed his prisoner. Roy hesitated, then called out, "Tucson jail. The woman with the birthmark who brought us food. You said she reminded you of Mama." Another pause, then the sound of a gun being uncocked. "What do you want, lawman?" Frank asked, still concealed behind the boulder. "Justice for Tucker's victims in Santa Fe, but I'm willing to focus on more recent events if you cooperate. Come out with your hands up, and we'll talk about your options." Slowly, Frank's gun slid into view from behind the rock, pushed away by its owner. Then the man himself emerged, hands raised to shoulder height, his weathered face a mask of resigned defiance. "Options," he repeated sarcastically. "Hang now or hang later, I reckon." Gabriel gestured for Eduardo to descend and collect Frank's weapon. "That depends on how helpful you decide to be. Tucker's already dead, which makes him the perfect scapegoat. Tell me what really happened, and maybe you and Roy face prison instead of the gallows." The brothers exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Frank nodded almost imperceptibly. "Tucker's death was an accident," Roy admitted. "We were up on Miller Land, checking the areas where the survey team found gold traces. Tucker was standing under a half-dead pine when a gust of wind brought down a big branch, crushed his skull before he could even shout. And Harrington saw an opportunity," Gabriel prompted. Frank took up the narrative. He'd been looking for a way to discredit the Miller woman, make it easier to pressure her into selling. When we brought Tucker's body back, he got this look like he'd just been dealt a winning hand. Told us to take the body back up there, leave it in the creek on Miller property, make it look like murder. "And the evidence found at the Miller ranch? The watch, the blood-stained clothes? Harrington sent us to plant those the night before the sheriff searched the place," Roy admitted. "We knew the layout because Tucker had been watching the ranch for weeks, learning their routines." Gabriel absorbed this information, pieces falling into place. So Harrington orchestrated the whole thing, the false evidence, the murder charge, the conviction, all to get his hands on gold deposits he'd discovered on Miller Land. "Gold worth killing for," Frank confirmed grimly. "Though to be fair, he never ordered Tucker's death. That really was just bad luck. Bad luck that Sarah Miller nearly died for," Gabriel reminded them coldly. "Would you have spoken up if she'd been killed at that post yesterday?" The brothers averted their eyes, their silence answer enough. Gabriel secured Frank's wrists as he had Roy's, then consulted his pocket watch. Nearly noon Sarah would have finished her meeting with Harrington and the judge by now, setting up the final confrontation at the Miller ranch. "We're taking a ride, gentlemen," he informed the Davis brothers. "You're going to repeat everything you just told me to Sheriff Porter, Judge Cartwright, and anyone else who needs to hear it. Consider it your first installment toward saving your miserable necks." As they mounted up, the Davis brothers sharing a horse with their hands still bound, Gabriel and Eduardo flanking them, Roy looked curiously at his captor. "Why do you care so much about the Miller woman?" he asked. "You didn't know her before yesterday." Gabriel's expression remained impassive. "I care about justice. It's in short supply out here. "There's more to it than that," Frank observed. Shrewdly, "I've seen how men look at women they're sweet on." Gabriel didn't dignify this with a response, but Eduardo smiled slightly, having noticed the same subtle signs in his employer's unexpected defender. They rode toward redemption at a steady pace, timing their arrival to coincide with the busiest hour in the town square. Maximum public exposure would ensure the Davis brothers couldn't conveniently disappear or change their story once Harrington realized they had been captured. "One last thing," Gabriel said as they approached the outskirts of town. "Harrington has arranged to meet Mrs. Miller at her ranch at 4 o'clock today. What was he planning?" The brothers exchanged another meaningful glance before Frank answered reluctantly. "He sent word to Lester Blake, told him to gather some men and be ready to ride to the Miller place this afternoon." "For what purpose?" Gabriel demanded, though. He already suspected the answer. "Harrington doesn't like loose ends," Roy explained with a shrug. Once he had her signature on the sale papers, the Miller woman and any evidence she might have were going to have an accident on their way out of the territory. Gabriel's jaw tightened. "Eduardo, change of plans. Take these two directly to the sheriff's office. Make sure Porter records their full confession. I'm writing for the ranch." "Mrs. Miller can handle herself," Eduardo reminded him. "She is stronger than she looks." "She shouldn't have to handle this alone," Gabriel replied, already turning his horse toward the eastern road. "Not when Harrington's bringing Blake and his men." As he galloped away, Frank called after him, "It won't just be Blake. Harrington's bringing everyone, at least 10 men." Gabriel raised a hand in acknowledgement, without looking back. The odds were worsening, but it didn't matter. He had faced worse in his years as a marshal and come through. Besides, something told him Sarah Miller was worth any risk he might take. The thought surfaced unbidden as his horse ate up the miles between town and the Miller ranch. When this was over, would he simply ride away as he had from so many other towns, other injustices? Or had something fundamental changed in the man who had spent years hunting others without allowing himself to be caught by anything or anyone? Gabriel pushed these questions aside, focusing instead on the immediate challenge. If Harrington was indeed planning an ambush, Sarah would need every advantage she could get, including the element of surprise that only Gabriel's early arrival could provide. The Miller ranch came into view just after 1 o'clock, the white-painted farmhouse gleaming in the afternoon sun. Gabriel approached cautiously, alert for any sign that Harrington had sent men ahead. The property appeared peaceful, with only the usual ranch hands visible going about their duties. Mrs. Abernathy met him at the door, concern evident in her lined face. "Mr. Reeves, we weren't expecting you back so soon. Is something wrong?" "Where is Mrs. Miller?" Gabriel asked, scanning the house's interior as he stepped inside. "In Mr. Miller's study, preparing the sale documents as planned. She returned from town about an hour ago. Said everything went exactly as you predicted." Gabriel nodded, relief mingling with renewed determination. "Good, we have time to prepare. Harrington is planning more than a simple business transaction this afternoon." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes widened with understanding. "I'll put on coffee," she said practically. "You look like you could use it before whatever's coming next." Gabriel found Sarah at her husband's desk, quill in hand as she carefully prepared what appeared to be legal documents. She looked up as he entered, surprise and then concern crossing her face. "You're early," she observed. "Does that mean—" "The Davis brothers confessed," Gabriel confirmed. "They're with Eduardo and Sheriff Porter now, giving sworn statements about Tucker's accidental death and Harrington's plot to frame you." Sarah's shoulders sagged with relief. "Then it's over. The confession will clear my name." "Not quite over," Gabriel corrected her gently. "Harrington is still coming here at 4, but he's bringing Blake and at least 10 armed men. He plans to take your land and eliminate any witnesses permanently. Instead of the fear he expected, Sarah's expression hardened with resolve. Then we'll be ready for him. How many men can we count on? Eduardo should return within the hour. That gives us 3 ranch hands, Mrs. Abernathy, you and me against Harrington's force. Gabriel ran a hand through his hair, tactical options already forming in his mind. Not ideal odds, but we have home ground advantage and the element of surprise. Sarah rose from the desk, her movements deliberate and controlled. This is my home, Mr. Reeves. I've defended it against drought, disease, and dishonest men for 2 years. I won't lose it now, not when we're so close to justice. As she stood before him, straight-backed and determined, despite the wound still healing beneath her clothing, Gabriel was struck by the realization that in all his years of tracking criminals and dispensing frontier justice, he had never met anyone quite like Sarah Miller. Her courage wasn't the brash bravado of gunslingers or the cold calculation of lawmen, but something deeper and more enduring. The quiet strength of someone who had faced loss and hardship, yet refused to surrender to bitterness or despair. No, he agreed softly. You won't lose it. Not while I'm here. Their eyes met and held for a long moment, unspoken understanding passing between them. Then, with the synchronicity of partners who had worked together far longer than their brief acquaintance would suggest, they turned their attention to preparing for the final confrontation with Wallace Harrington and the corrupt power he represented. The battle for the Miller Ranch and for justice and redemption was about to reach its climax. The next 2 hours transformed the peaceful Miller Ranch into a fortress. Gabriel directed the preparations with the precision of a military commander, drawing on tactics he had used during his years as a marshal when cornered by outlaws in remote locations. Every window was secured, escape routes established, and defensive positions fortified. The 3 remaining ranch hands, Miguel, Caleb, and John, were stationed strategically around the property, armed with rifles and clear instructions. Mrs. Abernathy, refusing to be relegated to the sidelines despite her 60 years, prepared bandages and loaded shotguns with grim efficiency. I nursed soldiers during the war, she informed Gabriel when he suggested she might prefer to wait in the cellar. And I buried my husband and 2 sons afterward. I'm no stranger to violence, Mr. Reeves. Eduardo returned just after 2 o'clock, bringing welcome news from town. The Davis brothers have signed sworn statements, he reported. Sheriff Porter has telegraphed the territorial authorities. Judge Cartwright is trying to distance himself from Harrington, claiming he was deceived about the evidence. And Harrington? Sarah asked, looking up from the revolver she was cleaning. Gabriel had given her a brief refresher on handling the weapon, though she had shown surprising proficiency already. Still planning to meet you here at 4, Eduardo confirmed. But the town is buzzing with rumors about the Davis brothers. Confession. Some of Harrington's men might be having second thoughts about riding with him. Gabriel nodded thoughtfully. Good. Uncertainty breeds hesitation. We can use that. He spread a rough map of the property on the kitchen table. Harrington will approach from the main road. He'll likely hold back and send Blake and a few men ahead to ensure it's not a trap. Which it is, Sarah observed with grim humor. Exactly. But not the kind they're expecting. Gabriel indicated positions on the map. Eduardo, you and Miguel cover the north approach from the barn. Caleb and John take positions by the corral to the south. Mrs. Abernathy will remain inside with a clear view of the front porch. And us? Sarah asked. You'll meet Harrington as planned on the porch. I'll be inside, out of sight but within earshot. If he's come to negotiate honestly, unlikely but possible, we let him sign the papers, take them as evidence of his attempted fraud, and send him on his way to face charges in Prescott. And if he hasn't? Sarah's voice was steady without a trace of fear. Gabriel's eyes met hers. Then we fight. But only if necessary, and only after we've documented his intentions clearly enough that no territorial judge can ignore them. The plan wasn't foolproof. No plan ever was when dealing with desperate men. But it gave them the best chance of ending Harrington's threat permanently while ensuring Sarah's legal position remained unassailable. Harrington looked around wildly, watching his carefully constructed power crumble before his eyes. This is absurd. She has nothing but the word of 2 criminals against mine. And the doctor's suppressed findings, Gabriel added. And the mining claim you filed on property you didn't own. And the sworn statements from Tucker's victims in Santa Fe connecting him to you. The evidence is overwhelming, Harrington. Your empire is finished. Something dangerous flickered in Harrington's eyes, the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. His hand moved with surprising speed toward his hip, drawing a small derringer that had been concealed in his waistband. 3 shots rang out simultaneously. Gabriel's Colt spoke first, the bullet striking Harrington's shoulder and spinning him around. Blake, acting on instinct or perhaps seizing an opportunity to switch sides while he could, fired a fraction of a second later, his shot catching Harrington in the leg. But it was the 3rd shot that proved decisive. Sarah's revolver, drawn and fired with unwavering precision, took Harrington directly in the chest. He staggered backward, shock registering on his face as he stared at the woman he had underestimated so catastrophically. That, Sarah said with quiet intensity, was for my children. For forcing them to watch their mother tied to that post. Harrington collapsed onto the porch, blood spreading across his expensive shirt. Gabriel kicked the dropped derringer away and knelt to check the fallen man's condition. He's alive, he announced after a moment. Though he won't be riding anywhere. Blake dismounted slowly, hands held away from his weapons. What happens now, Marshal? I'm not a marshal anymore, Gabriel reminded him. But I suspect the territorial authorities will have plenty of questions for all of Harrington's associates. How you answer them will determine your future. The tension seemed to drain from the yard as Harrington's men realized the power structure they had served was gone. Some began to drift away, eager to distance themselves from their employer's crimes. Others, including Blake, remained, perhaps calculating that cooperation now might mitigate their punishment later. Eduardo approached the porch, rifle still at the ready, but pointed at the ground. Sheriff Porter is coming, he reported, gesturing toward the road where dust rose from approaching riders. Looks like he's brought half the town with him. Indeed, as the group came into view, Gabriel recognized not just Porter, but Judge Cartwright, Dr. Wilson, and a dozen townspeople including Henry Woodson the blacksmith and Pastor Williams. They pulled up short at the sight of Harrington bleeding on the porch and his scattered forces in the yard. What in God's name happened here? Porter demanded, dismounting hastily. Justice, Gabriel replied simply, though it took a detour through violence to get here. The aftermath unfolded with surprising swiftness. Harrington was taken to town under guard, his wounds treated by Dr. Wilson, who confirmed they were serious, but not immediately life-threatening. Blake and several other men were detained for questioning, while the remainder were allowed to leave after surrendering their weapons. Judge Cartwright, eager to salvage what remained of his reputation, immediately signed and officially filed the document vacating Sarah's conviction. The territorial authorities, alerted by multiple telegrams, dispatched investigators who arrived the following day to begin untangling Harrington's web of corruption. Through it all, Sarah Miller stood tall, accepting neither pity nor excessive praise from the townspeople, who suddenly remembered their deep respect for her late husband and their shock at how she had been treated. Her focus remained on her children, who returned home the evening after the confrontation, blissfully unaware of how close they had come to losing everything. As the sun set on that eventful day, Sarah found Gabriel standing alone on the porch, staring out at the land that had nearly cost her life. "You've been quiet," she observed, coming to stand beside him. "Just thinking," he replied. "About your next hunt?" Now that the Davis brothers are in custody, your mission is complete." Gabriel turned to look at her, really look at her perhaps, for the first time without the immediacy of danger coloring his perception. The setting sun bathed her face in golden light, highlighting the quiet strength in her features and the intelligence in her clear eyes. "Actually," he said slowly, "I was thinking it might be time to stop hunting." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "After all these years? What would you do instead?" "I don't know." Gabriel leaned against the porch railing, his customary intensity softening. "I've been tracking men like Tucker for so long. I'm not sure I remember how to live any other way." "You could learn," Sarah suggested quietly, "if you wanted to." Something unspoken passed between them, a possibility neither was quite ready to name, but both could feel taking shape in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Your ranch needs a foreman," Gabriel observed casually. Eduardo mentioned. "He's thinking of returning to Mexico now that his family there is facing trouble." "Are you applying for the position, Mr. Reeves?" There was a hint of amusement in Sarah's voice, but her eyes were serious. "Maybe." He straightened, turning to face her fully. "Or maybe I'm just not ready to ride away from here quite yet." Sarah studied him thoughtfully. "My children have taken a liking to you. James asks 100 questions about your days as a marshal. Emma pretends not to be impressed, but I've seen her watching you when she thinks no one is looking. They're good children. They deserve a peaceful life after everything they've been through." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "They do. We all do." She hesitated, then added, "You know, there's gold on this property. Not as much as Harrington believed, perhaps, but enough to consider developing a small mine alongside the cattle operation. It would take someone with experience handling men, enforcing rules, maintaining order." Gabriel smiled slightly. "Someone like a former marshal?" "Perhaps." Sarah returned the smile, her own carefully measured but genuine. "If such a person were interested in putting down roots after years of wandering." Behind them, the door opened, and Emma appeared, her serious young face alight with unusual excitement. "Mama, Mr. Reeves. Pastor Williams is here with Judge Cartwright. They say the governor himself is coming to Redemption next week to personally address what happened." Sarah turned to her daughter, smoothing a strand of hair from the girl's face. "That's wonderful news, Emma. Please tell them we'll be right in." As Emma disappeared back into the house, Sarah and Gabriel shared a final glance, both aware that whatever lay between them would need time to develop, to be carefully tended like a garden planted in difficult soil. But for the first time in years, both could see a future that held more than survival or justice, a future that might include healing, growth, and perhaps even happiness. "We should go in," Sarah said finally. "Apparently we have a governor to prepare for." Gabriel nodded, but made no move to enter. "In a minute, I'd like to watch the sunset a bit longer." Understanding, Sarah left him to his thoughts. As darkness settled over the Arizona landscape, Gabriel Reeves, former U.S. Marshal, hunter of men, and defender of widows, contemplated the strange turns a life could take. He had ridden into Redemption, seeking justice for his slain partner, only to find something he hadn't realized he was searching for, a place where his skills could build rather than destroy, where the law he had served so long might actually protect those who deserved protection. And perhaps, though he hardly dared acknowledge it even to himself, he had found something even rarer, a woman whose courage matched his own, whose determination had been forged in the same fires of loss and resilience that had shaped him, and whose heart might, in time, have room for more than just her children and her land. The last light faded from the sky, stars emerging like distant promises in the endless western night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new beginnings. But for tonight, it was enough to stand on the porch of a home hard won and nearly lost, knowing that inside waited people who had come to matter more than he had allowed anyone to matter in longer than he could remember. Gabriel Reeves turned finally toward the warm light spilling from the windows of the Miller home. For the first time since he had laid his marshal's badge aside and dedicated his life to hunting killers, he felt something like peace settling into his bones. It was unfamiliar territory for a man who had made violence his companion for so long. But as he stepped through the doorway into the house that had become a sanctuary for a widow and her children, and perhaps for him as well, he found himself looking forward to exploring this new frontier with the same determination that had carried him across the old one. Behind him, the night deepened over Redemption, a town that had earned its name at last through the courage of a bleeding widow and the intervention of an angry cowboy who had walked in and silenced not just the town, but the demons that had driven him for so long across the unforgiving landscape of the American West. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.